Aperture.
I've heard myself obviously talk about my pictures a number of times before, so it'll be much more fun for me if you stop me during the presentation, obviously, but and also afterwards. It seems almost silly to be doing it by PowerPoint, but it was maybe easier. So afterwards, I encourage us to sort of walk around and we can look at the pictures and talk about them. I really discovered photography my freshman year at Yale in Lois Connor's intro photography class, and Lois is here with us tonight. So it's in many ways thanks to her that I'm standing here. And this is the first reel of film I shot on a 35 millimeter. And you can see I had a little problem processing the film, although not too bad. And sort of did all the things that one does when you take an intro photo class. I went to the cemetery because I thought that would be arty. And I took pictures of my friends in the dining hall and you know, the library, and kind of taking pictures of sort of our day-to-day lives, and did that for the full semester. At the end of that semester, Lois brought in her own class, her own work, and she shoots with a banquet camera and makes 717-inch negatives. And immediately when I saw the work that she was doing, I had a very covetous response, not only of wanting to own it someday and live with it and have the sort of the light of the collector was lit within me, but also a desire to make work like that. There was a way in which, when I saw the work, I knew immediately that this is what I wanted to do, and so I purchased with her help an 8x10 camera. For those of you who don't know, this is what it looks like. It sort of has an accordion shape, and you go under a cloth when you take a picture, and when I'm in public, people are always disappointed that there isn't a big puff of smoke when I take the pictures, but it's an amazing camera, and it's the camera I've been using pretty much ever since. New Haven being what it was in the early 90s, I was actually mugged a week or two after I received it, and no longer had a 35 millimeter for the rest of my time at Yale. Very much inspired by Lois's work, I started making landscape photographs around New Haven, and I think I discovered something that's very much a thread in the work that I still make to this day, which is this way that photography allows us to see things in the everyday, but reveal them to us in surprising ways, and capturing something that that you don't really see on your own. And so here you have a swamp by the side of the road, but somehow transformed in the photograph into something maybe more surprising and more beautiful. And then when I got to SV, I continued making landscape work for much of my 20s, and then when I got to the graduate program at the School of Visual Arts, I wanted to photograph my friends again. I hadn't really done that since that intro photo class with the 35 millimeter, and so I thought I would start taking pictures of my friends, and I was challenged by my classmates and my teachers about what I found interesting, and so I started making pictures of them watching their favorite TV shows. And so here you have a couple in bed watching Law and Order, and the idea was that the exposure would be the length of the TV show they were watching. That's obviously an idea I took from Sugimoto's very famous series of movie theaters, where he photographed a number of movie theaters and drive-ins for the length of the time the movie was playing. But as I made the pictures, to me they felt very different than the Sugimoto, and this is probably the most Sugimoto-like in terms of the positioning of the screen, but they were very much connected to the people in the photograph, and I realized that through the length of the exposure and the use of the 8x10, the elements that in the picture that have moved become sort of blurry ghosts. So obviously you don't see my friends in this picture, but you get details like their wedding portrait is on the coffee table behind them. And then there's sort of this magical effect of the length of the exposure. And so they lived in a high-rise in Battery Park, and what you see in the sky are the traces of planes taking off at Newark Airport, and you have boats going up and down the river, and I took this picture. It also happened to be my birthday. It was November 25th, and so they'd gotten this big birthday cake for me, and we'd had a couple slices, so there's this odd birthday cake on the coffee table. And it was sort of a journey to any parent out there, a sort of cautionary tale of why I was interested in making these pictures of people watching TV. I grew up in Paris, and my parents, in wanting to encourage us to read, didn't have a television. This is a picture of my dad and his wife. They now have a sort of 12-inch little tube TV that they pull out when there's breaking news. I think this is watching CNN on the eve of the Gulf War or something. And of course, like many American kids, grow up without getting to drink any alcohol and then go to college and overindulge. I grew up without watching any television, and by the time I graduated from Yale, I'd seen every single episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I gathered every Wednesday night in our common room and watched Melrose Place. And this is actually a picture, not in college, this is a group of women watching The Bachelorette. But there was something sort of amazing about getting together and watching this TV show every week. And I really missed that after I graduated. But what I found is that there were still those television shows that we would not necessarily watch together, but that we would all watch and then talk about. And like in the last 2 weeks, invariably when I've gotten together with friends, we've talked about the Oscars, or we've talked about certain TV programs that we all watch. It's very rare that we've all seen the Marvel show at the Met, or that we've seen the same play, or that we've read the same book. But TV shows are this thing that we've all somehow take part in, and so a lot of our conversations connect to that. And so I thought it was really interesting, this idea of photographing them watching the favorite TV program. I also quickly realized that computers were taking a big part of people's lives, and this is a picture I took of Lois. And again, in terms of thinking of it as a portrait, I love it as a portrait of a photographer. Here are her impeccably organized box of negatives stacked on the bookcase. And New York being what it is, she uses this is a closet that she's converted into sort of a workspace. Those little strips of tape are there so that she can block out the light when she's processing her negatives in the same space, which it's again, sort of all these details in these spaces that I find really, really wonderful. But what's amazing to me is how unaware we are of the role that this is taking on in our lives. And here's a picture I took of Calvin Trillin, the author, and I'd asked him what his favorite TV show was, and he'd answered that it was the NewsHour. And when I got there, he was fiddling with his VCR, which seems kind of impossible to believe, but 10 years ago we were still using VCRs. And he was madly fidgeting with it, and I asked him what he was doing, and he said, well, I have to tape The Sopranos. I can't miss a single episode of The Sopranos, and I'm heading out to dinner tonight, and I won't see it. And there's this sense that people are really unaware of that. They don't realize, often people will tell me, oh, I don't watch much TV, and within 10 minutes, they've told me that they watch, The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, Scandal, or if they're more highbrow, they'll say House of Cards. But it's amazing. A lot of people really think that they don't watch much television, or that they don't spend much time at their computer. But in fact, it is such a big part of our lives. And I think that it's something that's really interesting to think about. That this is me in a computer in San Francisco, and my parents are still in France, and my brother lives in China, and I love this ability that we have of communicating with each other. But it is also coming at a certain expense in terms of face-to-face communication. We're privileging this ability to communicate instantaneously, sometimes at the expense of face-to-face engagement. And certainly it's fundamentally altering the way we spend our time, the way we engage others. I know Pete Wells was talking about how it's astonishing when people are waiting now in restaurants, everybody's on their own cell phones instead of talking to the bartender or engaging the person next to them. And I think it's something really interesting to think about, how the rhythms of our lives are changing. And when you think of it historically, I think art is a very important way for us to take measure of what's happening in our lives. The 19th century French painters were obsessed with painting trains and train stations. The trains were fundamentally altering the rhythms of people's lives. They also, in relation to the Marvel show, Haussmann had suddenly built these big boulevards. The first department stores were being built, like Le Bon Marché. And suddenly it was acceptable for women to walk the street without being streetwalkers. And so you have this completely new society that takes place on the streets of Paris, and the painters are obsessively documenting it and engaging it. And what's been amazing is in the 10 years since I've started making these pictures, the sort of prevalence of portable devices and the importance that they've started taking on in our lives. From here, someone playing a Game Boy, someone on their iPad in Washington Square Park. A lot of my parents' friends think that it's someone reading a book because the multiple exposures of the screen look like pages of a book, but it's a tablet. Or here I am sort of on the shore of Lake Superior. I have this great place I love to go to where we don't have television, internet, or anything, but of course I'm still desperately intent on getting contact with the outside world, and if I go at a certain time of day by the lakeside, I can get cell phone reception and sort of get news from the world. And again, in another time, would we have been sitting by a fire? Would we have been talking to each other? I think it's interesting to think of how the rhythms, have changed and the way it's altering our lives. Here we have Penelope Umbrico, who is one of my teachers at SVA, and her two daughters. After dinner, they pull out their laptops and spend family time, but the daughters were feeding virtual pets and talking to friends, and Penelope was answering emails. And this idea of sort of the family dinner and getting together and how it's being changed. And this picture particularly reminds me of spirit photographs, the sort of 19th century trick photographs where through the use of double exposures, photographers were pretending or saying that they were showing people with the spirits of their dearly departed loved ones. And I think while this is trickery, I love this idea of photography, again, showing us something that we can't perceive, that somehow we connected to the real, but surprising and different than what we perceive. And in a case like this, obviously, this is a couple preparing dinner and eating in a railroad apartment on the Upper East Side. It's immediately familiar to us. I mean, we know these scenes, but yet they're somewhat surprising. And I think while the connection to Sugimoto is obviously there in terms of the idea of the screens, for me, my work has been much more connected to the work of, for example, Abelardo Morel and his camera obscuras, and this idea of taking photography and through the use of just the pure fundamental tools of photography, creating images that are connected to the real, but yet reveal something completely magical and surprising in the real. And actually, I was very fortunate to have him be my thesis advisor in grad school. And when he saw this picture, he kept pointing to the reflection of the photographs in the window and kept saying, you know, I think this is where your photograph is. And at the time, I thought he was completely crazy. I told him, I'm making pictures of people watching TV and working at their computers. Why would I make a picture of a reflection in a window? But it's been an interesting thing where in some of the more recent work that I'll get to later, I think that was advice that's sort of taken many years to bear its fruit. And in terms of people that are students of photography or making their own work, I think it's something very interesting to think about how you get feedback on your work, and sometimes it's not necessarily the right feedback for you right in that moment, but that as you continue making the work, subtle changes come in and your interests in making it change. When my work was first shown in Paris, the French lived up to all their expectations and asked the gallery where were the pictures of people having sex or masturbating at their computers. And I said, well, you know, when I ask my friends what they do, that's somehow not the answer that comes up. And so it was very sweet. This very shy woman that worked at the gallery at the time said that her boyfriend lived in Germany and he was going to come visit, and so I should come over and make a picture of them. And so I did. And we were all a little nervous, of course, so we were drinking martinis, and you can see there's a bunch of martini glasses sort of littered around the picture. And they lived in a tiny studio apartment, and they were like, well, do you want to go in the kitchen? And I thought that would be really awkward, and so I was like, why don't I just set up the camera, show you how to operate it, and then, you know, I'll leave and I'll come back tomorrow. And unfortunately, he had drank too many martinis, especially after traveling in from Germany, and passed out stone cold, so he's very sharp in my picture. And then after a period of trying to make the best of the situation, she sat on the side of the bed and just watched TV for the rest of the evening. And then I ended up making a picture of my boyfriend and I enjoying a hotel room that we were staying in Vancouver. People often ask me why these pictures are in black and white. And as I said, the idea was very much that the TV would be the main source of illumination in these scenes. But in fact, there's a lot of light sources that are playing. In this image, for example, you have the TV, obviously, but you also have the fireplace, you have the light behind the alcove, and you have all the light coming in from the city. And in color, these are different light sources that sort of compete with each other, but in black and white, you can create a sort of unified visual language that ties the scene together and allows you to enjoy it. I talked about how there's a connection to reality, but I think people often mistake a photograph for being a document of the absolute real. I remember a few years ago being very upset when the Museum of Modern Art did a show of Picasso and portraiture, and under each painting they had little photographs of the people sort of to say, this is what the person really looked like. But, you know, the photographs were made by people like Dora Maar and were very much, photographs and I think just as much a portrait that could or could not look like the person that was being. So anyways, this is the same room in color. And you can see that there's definitely, it's, transformed in black and white. There's a degree of tackiness that gets removed, and the room feels actually quite a bit bigger. And so there's obviously this connection to the real, but I think the act of making a photograph is also a fiction and a transformative experience. I was asked to photograph the Museum of Natural History by the New York Times Magazine. I think they were probably, at a loss as to who to think of, and because of the connection to Sugimoto and the fact that he'd done a famous series of dioramas, they made the connection and asked me to go. And I was very nervous. It was my first time photographing there, and I kept getting phone calls from them asking me, that I had to photograph the dioramas, but that they were bored of seeing the same photos of the dioramas over and over and over again, and that I had to find some new way of photographing it, which of course was a very intimidating directive to be receiving. But this picture from the planetarium I loved, and how the sort of the city lights in the background end up looking like little stars twinkling behind the planets. But I spent a lot of times looking at the diorama. This is one of my favorites, and it's the Sugimoto photograph of the diorama. And so I ended up making a picture of me looking at the diorama. And again, it's interesting, I think, in the diorama you can see that the animal is part of a herd and he's in a group, but somehow in the photograph that I made of him, he's completely isolated, and it's just him and me, and I'm very much sort of defeated and nervous about how I'm gonna, go about making these pictures, and he's sort of calling out to me and giving me courage. But we didn't end up using this picture because it ended up being a portfolio of pictures after the museum had closed for the night, and it felt confusing to have my presence in the image. But in seeing this, I really became interested in the sort of dialogue that happens in between the people in the museum and the things that they see. And I fell in love again with the dinosaurs. It's impossible to walk into that museum and not sort of be in awe of it. And I think what I love is, again, in using the fundamental tools of photography, I'm able to bring the dinosaur to life. When you're there, obviously the dinosaur is static and not moving. But in a photograph, and in using the way we perceive movement and read movement in a photograph, you can make it really come to life in a way that I think is completely different than experiencing it in person. And I think we're all very familiar with how the use of short exposures has allowed us to understand our world and reveal things in our world that we're not familiar with. This is Muybridge's study of a horse in motion, and up until he made these pictures, people literally did not know how a horse galloped. They didn't know that the one moment where his feet are all off the ground or when the feet are together, and if you look at paintings from before this time, they're completely inaccurate. And I think that what I try to do is, in using longer exposures, also find something surprising and revealing of our everyday world that we can't see just through our own perception of it. As I said, I grew up in Paris, and I was there until I was 17, and at the age of 34, so exactly having spent half my life in New York and half my life in Paris, I went back to Paris and started photographing some of the really famous sites. This is La Sainte-Chapelle, and it was a really challenging experience to sort of go to these incredibly iconic places and try to make a photograph that would somehow find something surprising. And I was here on a Saturday, and there was all these tourists, and they were all taking pictures with their flashes, and I was getting very angry at them because I was convinced that their flashes were ruining my picture, and certainly their flashes were serving absolutely no purpose in illuminating this huge space. But then when I saw the picture, I loved how they became sort of transformed, that the tourists with their flashes sort of became like parishioners holding candles at a service, and this sense of the modern day person is still holding vigil there with a candle, I thought was something really, and I love the layering of history that you have in this space, the representations of man going back to the paintings that were done in the 12th century that are already representing an even earlier time and then being in dialogue with the contemporary. I also got the permission to photograph at the Louvre, which was an amazing experience. They asked me to get there about half hour, 40 minutes before it was open to the public, so I got to spend a certain amount of time roaming the Hall of Italian Paintings by myself, which was a lovely experience. And as I was there, I was talking to the security guards before the museum opened and asked them how long it would take the first people to get there, and we sort of started playing bets. And I think I won. I said I thought Americans would be the first ones there, and sure enough, 9 minutes after the museum had opened, a group of slightly out of breath Americans came running in. It's a pretty impressive achievement when you think that they have to go into the pyramid, down, assuming they've already bought their tickets, they then have to go up a set of escalators, up the staircase where the Winged Victory is, and then down the Hall of Italian Paintings to get there. So 9 minutes is a pretty impressive time in which to make it. But it was a really fascinating experience. It's really the only time that I've been in a public space with the 8x10 camera and been completely invisible. People walk in and are attracted to her and just become completely oblivious to anything else that's happening in the room, whether it's me with the 8x10 or there's one of the biggest paintings at the Louvre, Le Noces de Cana, is hanging on the wall behind me, and no one is looking at it. I mean, it's astonishing how everybody just like gravitates. And this guy is really wonderful. It's taking, of course, a picture because, and many of them with flash, and since she's behind glass, all those pictures are not going to turn out, but he's there desperately taking a picture. You can see it in the print more easily than you can on the screen. You actually can see his striped shirt sort of moving through the scene. He was sort of hovering to get into place. I think it's just one of those, it's very funny how, again, this sense of the mediation through technology, that you see people now going through museums sort of recording their trip through the museum more than actually engaging the museum itself. Yep. So as I started moving into the public sphere, the exposures got quite a bit shorter and became obviously arbitrary as opposed to being dictated by the length of the show that was being watched. So the exposure here is like 3 minutes. Some of those exposures are even shorter, like the dinosaur or the parade shot are probably the shortest exposures that I have in the show. Yeah. So because I was given with the Mona Lisa, I only did 6, which in retrospect I'm sort of astonished and sort of like I almost scare myself in thinking about it that I got this incredible access and took the gamble to only do 6 exposures. But I was only given a fairly short period of time to be in that room with a tripod, and I was also given access to the staircase where the Winged Victory was and another room, and I had to save film for that, and I didn't think I had the time to reload my film holders. I have to set up a 10 and sort of do that. So I just sort of, and I'd been coming from doing the TV pictures where I only really shot ever 1 sheet of film. So 6 already felt like a luxury step, but in retrospect, it seems crazy to me. I mean, I think if I were to do it now, I would definitely try to reload my film and do 12 or 15 or more. And of the 6, this is really the only one that turned out because I made the first ones I think when there were still too few people, and so the room just has a handful of people moving about, and it doesn't have the kind of the effect that I wanted to get. I did a project in London, which was really fun in terms of also broadening the idea of what goes into making a photograph. I think I'd started the project with this very strict rule of photographing my friends for the length of their favorite TV show, and little by little sort of stripping away sort of the sense of the defining constraints as to the project, which I think is a very important part. I think both setting up guidelines to your project and then sort of allowing it to evolve over time is an important thing. And so I got access to photograph a bunch of different locations, including this great hat shop in London. And I've always loved how the Panama hats sort of look like I sort of love picturing older British men that are sort of shocked that the saleswoman's ankles are being, flashed in front of them. And so their heads have all suddenly tilted down and staring at her ankles. And then there's that great collection of hats going across the top. And again, sort of the sense of time and the layering of time and the different, the present and the past, and sort of that sense of the time moving forward. I photographed rush hour at Grand Central, and many of you, if you're used to rush hour at Grand Central, will notice that it does not look this empty usually. And I love this Salgado photograph of Church Station, and this is very much what I wanted to do, But I ended up much more with Daguerre's picture of Paris, where the only guy that shows up is the guy who stops to get his shoes polished. And so in my photograph, you have some figures, but not that many. And you have, the usual suspects, people stopping to talk on the phone. You have people buying train tickets. This guy I've never figured out. To me, it looks like his battery died and he just stopped moving in the middle of the scene. And then maybe most surprising, you have this couple, and her legs are wrapped around his torso. And they're having a very amorous moment at rush hour in Grand Central. And they're in the back. So they found a sort of discreet corner, I guess, but still somewhat surprising for rush hour at Grand Central. But I love this idea that this is, here we have rush hour, and if I'd wanted to get this Salgado photograph, I realized in retrospect that I would have had to do exposures of 30 seconds or 40 seconds. Each of these panels is 4 minutes long, and in the 4 minutes, the vast majority of the people have vanished. You have sort of a density of people like that's happening here, but most people have completely disappeared, which I think in the end is something that I love that element, that I go in sometimes with a very specific idea, and in the end I find myself often being surprised, and I keep sort of comforting myself that it's not a failure on my part, but that if I keep being surprised, hopefully people will equally be surprised when seeing the photographs. I often, and I realize this is not a good time to be saying this, don't think artists are the best people to talk about their work. I think we have ideas, and hopefully good work, I think, means many different things to different people, and there are many different ways of looking at the same series of pictures. On that note, there's a smaller show of mine right now going on at the Sasha Wolf Gallery, where looking at a lot of these same pictures, but through a very autobiographical lens of my life with my ex-boyfriend. And I think it's very interesting how work can mean different things to different people. When this work was being shown in New York, some big Christian Monitor newspaper or something wrote a big article and was talking about how this was the effects of living in a godless society. Not what I brought to making the work by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it was an interesting interpretation, and that the people vanish because they're not living in connection with God, and it was not a necessarily completely well-argued argument, but it was an entertaining read. I've had a lot of people. I had people that have looked at the museum pictures, including the Mona Lisa, and have talked about how this is where art goes to die, and again, not what I see in making it by any stretch of the imagination, but it's interesting that would elicit that with them. I think with the Screen Lives pictures, people often want to know if I'm being critical or encouraging about the use of technology, and as I said, I certainly love it, but I also question it. And so after traveling for a bunch of years doing this Paris project and London project, and I was away from New York for months at a time, I was really feeling like I wanted to recommit to living in New York, and I took a job teaching for one semester at the School of Visual Arts and was making my students go out every week to photograph. And so I felt, well, that's a little two-faced of me if I don't live by the same standards. So I sort of said, I'm just going to go about and take my camera with me and sort of almost connect back to being a street photographer and just go out about and make pictures. So something like the Macy's Day Thanksgiving Day Parade would happen, and I would say I have to find a way to make a picture of that. And I went and did that. Occupy Wall Street was going on, and I had a student who was bringing in what I didn't think were very successful pictures of Occupy Wall Street, and so I thought, well, I should go down and see, try it myself, and it was a really interesting experience. I was worried about feeling like I was invading people's spaces, but they were really supportive and curious, and I found that many times that the 8x10 in a way puts people at ease in a way that I think getting in their faces with a smaller camera might make people feel like it's a more adversarial. You're so clearly not hiding what you're doing when you take out a big camera, and I don't think people feel like you're trying to do something without their knowledge. And then over the length of the exposure, obviously people sort of relax and don't become as focused. I mean, when I would do the Screen Lives pictures, the first few minutes people would be, the phone would ring and they would say, can I answer the phone? And I'd sort of say, well, do you normally answer the phone while you're watching Breaking Bad, or do you know, not answer your phone? And then after 10 minutes, people sort of forget that you're there, and it becomes much more, it becomes, I think, much easier in a way to work. I have a much harder time sort of directing people in the sort of standard way that a portrait photograph would require. I'd heard about this carousel that had just been installed at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and I was in Brooklyn to photograph something else, but I got there a little early, and I thought, oh, I'll go check it out. And as I got there, there was this amazing sunset, and so what you see is the Brooklyn Bridge, which is this structure being reflected in the front of the glass. It's a glass cube designed by Jean Nouvel, and then here you have the Manhattan Bridge. It's in that park where the two bridges come together, and sort of this. And I love sort of circles and squares and the sort of the bringing together of those two shapes. And here you have the square cube holding this circular carousel. And in this moment, it was really like a magical. The sun was setting, and it was again very much as close to being a spur of the moment shoot as anything I've done. I mean, certainly something like the Mona Lisa is like months of preparation to get permission, and this was a very spur of the moment. And I love this guy who's has a Mamiya or Hasselblad in his hands, and obviously very intrigued by me setting up the 8x10 and just sort of staring at me. But I think also obviously in the use of these long exposures, you know, so much of photography is sort of about asserting a presence, a sort of, you know, here I am, this happened. But in my work with the longer exposures, I think there's also a sense of the fleeting nature of our presence, and the sort of that this is, we're passing through. I mean, the whole idea of city stages is, you know, we're here passing our lives, but that moment is fleeting, and there's going to be a moment where we go off stage, and the stage will remain, but we're no longer occupying it. And I think that sense of the progression of time and our presence is something that I find very interesting, and obviously never more so than in the picture I did on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. From where I live in New York, I could see the World Trade Center, and I was having breakfast the morning it happened, and I was obviously heavily marked by it, as everyone here has been. And I wanted to make a photograph on the 10th anniversary. I'd really thought the Towers of Light were one of the most beautiful memorials, certainly probably the most successful memorial since the Vietnam War memorial. And it was going to stop being as big a marker in the skyline because the World Trade Center was starting to go up and was going to, you know, replace the tribute in light. And I thought I should really try to make a photograph. And so I went to the Brooklyn Promenade, and I was astonished to not only find a crowd of people, which I maybe would have expected, but a crowd of people wanting to make photographs. And I think that there is this incredible power that photography has in allowing us to process our emotions. And as I said, like a lot of the Screen Lives work, my interest is in sort of how processing the changes in our lives. But I think photography is this very powerful way in which a lot of people, just as a matter of instinct, make pictures to sort of record these moments, and the connection to reminding themselves of being there and their moment there, and I think that's something that's really amazing about making photographs. And so I'd initially thought I was just going to make a picture of the skyline, and was much more excited in a way, again, to find this happening and make this picture of all these people gathered to make in essence the same picture I was making. And it was interesting. A lot of people were complaining that there was this very low cloud cover that night, and because, you know, on a clear night the beams go up as seemingly to the moon. But I love that the low cloud cover sort of limited the height of the beams to the height of the towers, and that they sort of dissolved into this puddle of light. I thought it was something, again, just the beauty of photography, and sort of just letting you know, what's there happen. Actually, on a night after an opening here, I was walking home on the High Line, and I'd been wanting to photograph along the High Line. And I stopped and made this picture at that observation well that they have, where people are basically looking up along 10th Avenue. And I loved this. It was, you know, after several tries of different parts of the High Line, this is the picture where it came together for me. I love both the sort of the sense of old New York. You have the tenement building and the new building, and then just the geometry of the lines and the light. But again, this sense of, what I was saying about Pete Wells and people waiting in restaurants, here you have 3 groups of people, but everyone is engaged sort of on their own phone. People often ask about, what's your favorite picture? And invariably at some level it's a recent picture just because you're excited and it's new. And I was really excited to photograph here. It's in the town of Marseille in the south of France, and Norman Foster has built this insane shade structure because in the summertime it gets to be 100, 110 degrees, and people wait in these long lines to go on boat tours of the Marseille shoreline and the calanques that are there. And so they were waiting in the sun and people were fainting and complaining. So he built this structure to provide shade, but the underside of it is this incredibly reflective surface. And so people now gather and take pictures of themselves and look up at themselves and sort of, wave and do all these things. And I loved seeing the interaction of the crowd in it. And in the picture, to me, it also connecting back to Abe's camera obscura, this is the most camera obscura-ish of all my pictures. You have the entire upside down scene, which I encourage you either in front of the print or right now to sort of tilt your head. It's much easier to read it when you're looking at it the right side. But ultimately, it sort of captures everything that I love about photography, and it shows that a photograph is a document of obviously something real, but also fiction. You have the exact same scene in both halves of the image, but yet they look completely different. The photograph is a fiction that's the result of the point of view that we take onto the world, and this magic that happens, that you have the same crowd, but it looks completely different from shooting from within the crowd versus like the other half of the picture. It looks like I took it from like a second-story window down onto the crowd, and how you can see the same moment, but in fact they look completely separate. And I think there's something really fundamentally that I love about that photography is connected to the real and is a representation of the real, but it's also a complete fiction that we're spinning and hopefully finding something that people will find surprising in it. So that's that. As I said, I'm happy to take questions, or we can walk around and look at the pictures, or. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, to what degree is the luck and just sheer chaos play a role in this? Obviously, it's a time photograph. And are you, thank you. And are you, like, surprised, pleasantly surprised that you see?
I'm always surprised by the results. I mean, there's a limit, there's an element of where I anticipate what I'm getting, and then there's always the element of surprise. And as I said, with Mona Lisa, there's 6 exposures, and they are completely different, and there's really only the one that for me is very successful. And it's amazing how moments will end up registering. In that picture that's in the middle of the grid up there, it's a picture of me, and the moment where I'm turning off that light is clear because I'm so close to the light bulb that even though that only took an instant, it shows up perfectly in the photograph. Whereas other actions, it will, sometimes there have been people that sort of were intent on showing up in the photo and would say, I'm not going to move, I'm not going to move, and then they almost completely vanish. And there's a way in which it's impossible to fully predict how the movement of people is going to register and what moments are going to show up and not show up. And as I said, like with Saint-Chapelle, I was convinced all those flashes were ruining the picture. And in the end, it's what makes the picture for me. It's the sense of the modern day tourist holding a modern day candle, which is their camera, moving through this space. And I love that, and I couldn't have anticipated that, and I wouldn't have come up with it. It's the magic of letting that sort of happen and play itself in the photograph. Yep.
Have you ever tried with the long exposures in color film?
I have a few times. As I said, with a lot of my work, I just find that there's a way in which the colors sort of have been competing with each other instead of creating this sort of unified visual language that I'm attracted to. The color sort of, and I shot Saint-Chapelle in color as well as black and white because I thought, this is Saint-Chapelle, the stained glass windows are what it's most famous for, and it seemed like a shame not to try that in color. But in the end, what you notice is that like the tourist in the red T-shirt suddenly, the way you can read the guy with the striped shirt moving through Mona Lisa, someone in a red T-shirt will suddenly become very readable, and that becomes this very distracting element to me. And so far, none of the ones that I've shot in color were as successful as they were in black and white. But it's something that I'm interested in. But I think that color will be about playing off, specifically for me, the interest will be in sort of creating this push and pull and sort of taking the picture apart in a way, as opposed to bringing it all together. Anybody else? Well, as I said, I mean, I'm happy also, like, we can walk around and look at specific pictures. And I'm reminded I'm also signing books, and obviously happy to do that. But thank you for coming in this dreary night and